Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at onpurposely.com.
We live in a time of unprecedented comfort. We value safety and security, and maybe that's why it's so easy for us to be shaken when the straight road we're on takes a sudden curve and seems to be pointing us in a direction we don't want to go. Welcome to the Shaken Podcast. I'm Steve Sunshine. Your confidence, your mood, your perspective, even your faith may be shaken because of something that's happened in your life. Jesus told us we'd have trouble in this world, so we're shaken but not surprised. He also said, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." In this podcast, you'll hear honest conversations with people who have or are going through life-altering hard times and have found that God was with them in the midst of it all.
And a lot of them, it wasn't resolved. Like, it wasn't like, oh, like I had this and then I was healed and then I got divorced and then my husband asked for forgiveness. No, it's not that. But it's that when they feel the light dawning into a new season, they look back and see, I have a resiliency to my faith and a trust in God that I did not have before that I went through this.
That's pastor, speaker, and podcaster Nicole Unice. She's just written a book called Not What I Signed Up For. If you're one of the 100% of people who at one point or another have had the experience of God's plan not lining up with your hopes and dreams, stick around. This conversation's for you. Our guest is Nicole Unice, author of the book Not What I Signed Up For. Nicole, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here. And I wish we didn't have seasons like Not What I Signed Up For seasons, but it feels like whatever the circumstances, we often find ourselves somewhere in our life story in a season we weren't expecting. And I'm here to help us guide our way through that with God's help.
Absolutely. So what made you decide to write this particular book?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I have been a Bible teacher for a long time and have often just really am passionate about all of us finding our own selves in the stories of the Bible. Just the fact that the Bible's full of stories, I think they're there, and that's by design, that we're invited to kind of insert ourselves into those stories, to use imagination that God gave us to learn about, just on the very basic level, like what does a story teach us about people, and what does a story teach us about God? And then, of course, God's interaction with people. So that's always been like in the background. And one of my favorite characters in scripture is Joseph from the book of Genesis. And I've taught that through that before that material, but it wasn't until 2019 where I found myself in a very unexpected season that I went and revisited that story for all of the human aspects of this really long, involved character study of a person who found himself in a season he never would have signed up for. And what I think in the details of that story, the way that God reveals how he meets us in our unexpected seasons as well. Yeah.
So are you, would you be willing to share what it was that led you to that?
Yeah, I feel I feel like God gave me a nice 1-year runway before the rest of the world also entered into an unexpected season in 2020. It was 2019, and I had been in a ministry position that I loved at a church that I loved for a while, and just for a series of reasons, it was the right time to step away from that role. And I didn't see it coming. I thought that was kind of the place that I was going to continue to be rooted. And when God made it clear that it was time to step away from that and into, not like I didn't have a plan on what was going to happen next, I just never could have expected kind of what would transpire after that. What felt like an obedient decision ended up being, a change in our life. Of course, the world changed, which is a huge part of it. But in the period of, those 4 or 5 years, I stepped away from a ministry position, from a church, from relationships. Friendships ended. We left our home. We moved to a different part of the city. Like, sort of everything was in upheaval. And I am a person who teaches on change, and my background is as a therapist before I was a pastor. So really intimately acquainted with the work of change and life circumstances, and just found myself surprisingly to me, like not equipped for that level of kind of uncertainty. And I define and not what I signed up for season as a time with an uncertain outcome and an unknown timeline. And there's something about the uncertain outcome and the unknown timeline. We do not know when it's going to come to an end that really, I think, plunges us into this opportunity for a deeper level of faith, for a lot of new levels of understanding of ourselves and the way that we operate in the world. And I found the story of Joseph to be the place to go to walk through that season and really look for God's fingerprints in the story of Joseph and what God was teaching Joseph and what Joseph was learning about God in that really long season, like so much longer than any of us would really like sign up for sure.
If you've either had a significant, I'm not what I signed up for moment in your life, or you will at some point.
Right.
Mine is Parkinson's disease, which has caused other little offshoots of things that I didn't sign up for. And I love the title, Not What I Signed Up For, because you can tell you're dealing with some things that are very heavy and serious, yet you're doing it in a way that's a little more lighthearted. And I think you got it divided up into some kind of big categories: testing, trusting, and thriving. Is that right?
Triumphing, yeah. Thriving, triumphing. So, yeah. Yeah. Also thriving. Right. I mean,
I need to write more slowly. Because I jotted it. Okay, so testing is the point at which something has happened, something that you wouldn't choose. Right. And so what do you see that looking like in a healthy way, and then maybe in an unhealthy way?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. And I think testing is confusing for Christians because we're like, does God test people? What's he, am I in like a pass fail scenario? Am I going to get a grade? And I like to make sure that we understand that testing in God's use of the term testing, he's a God who knows all. So testing is only revealing what is already there in us. When we enter into seasons and we talk about the book, the things that I think we all enter into and the things that Joseph enters into, tests of character, tests of humility, tests of patience. When we enter into those tests, it's more like God's giving us a placement exam. Like, hey, I'm going to help you understand where you are on your journey of faith. This isn't something that is new to God. And it's not something that God's using to hold over us or condemn us or judge us. Because God knows. God already knows your story, But it is a chance for us to really understand what we really believe and who we are becoming. And a lot of times I think that comfort and times maybe like peacetime in our stories, we can start kind of engaging in a faith that has a lot of things mixed into it. And a lot of ideas on like what makes a good life and what makes me a blessed person and what does it look like to have a calling. And we can get a lot of different pieces of our identity wrapped up in that. And it's oftentimes in those not what I signed up for seasons that God just allows that stuff that was already there to be revealed to us as well. And then we have an opportunity to partner with God in what he's sanctifying in us, what he's deepening in us in those seasons. So I think it's really a big part of testing is knowing like this is an integrity, a way of knowing with integrity what you are becoming and what you are believing, and any of those lies or places where God's like, hey, that's not who I am. And that's not what blessing means. And that's not what it looks like to live a good life in my economy. And that's what I think tests can do for us.
It seems like, the Bible talks about being refined in a fire like gold. And the testing can purify you. Well, I mean, on one hand, you've got what you just said, which is it's testing to see whether the gold will hold, will withstand the test. But it also, if we're willing, can strengthen us. And I don't want to go into the cliche of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, because that's not always true. But I've learned, I think, that when things are difficult, the more you lean into God, the more he leans into you, and you do draw strength and peace from that. Yeah. And I think that's where growth comes in. The hardest thing to do is to have something bad happen and say, oh, this is an opportunity. Yeah. But eventually you may see it that way.
Exactly. And in fact, in this next section on trusting, so we find
Mm,
ourselves like, okay, I'm learning these things about me, or God's giving me an invitation, like you said, to lean in, and he leans in. And then we do have to trust the opportunity. Like, and it's not like, oh, let me parlay this suffering into like immediately, and for
right.
all things good. We certainly don't do that for other people. We certainly don't say to other
Right.
people in suffering, like, God has a great opportunity for you. But one thing I think we discover in those times is, what does it look like to show up for the life that I have, even if it's not the life that I would have chosen, or even if
Hmm.
my limitations are not the ones I would have chosen? What about this life, though? And one of the really cool, like, little pieces of the story, there's so many of these details that are so interesting, but there's a couple of places this happens in scripture. One of the places is with Joseph, another place is with Nehemiah. And in both places, you have this moment where Joseph is interacting with power, and he is in a place of suffering. He's in a not what I signed up for season. He's a slave. And it says in scripture that he noticed people. And so at one point, Joseph is in the prison, and he notices, as he's attending to the cupbearer and the baker, he notices that they look dejected, that they look depressed. And he asks them, he says, like, why do you look down? And again, that's an easy thing to just like miss in the story, this long story. But if you think about it for a minute, if you're in your own place of suffering, one of the temptations is to become very self centered. It's to become very sort of inwardly focused on what's going on with me and the trouble that I'm in. And here we see this example of, hey, even in the midst of your worst, you're present enough and humble enough to want to care for other people, like in the midst of that. And I do think that there's opportunities within our not what I signed up for seasons to be present and to trust that God has placed us in a position for a reason,
Hmm.
and to maximize that reason. Even if that reason is, I'm getting chemo at this infusion center and I'm
Yeah.
helpless and vulnerable, and yet there's a person in front of me that is used to caring for others that I might be able to care for. And that's very challenging to, there's that requires a deep level of faith to believe that God's doing that, especially if you're angry or grieving about your season. But it's still
Hmm.
true though. Like, even if it's hard to receive, it is true that God gives us opportunities and places us intentionally, even in our seasons that we would not have taken that path, that he's still there and he's still working.
When you talked about trusting,
Hmm.
trusting God, trusting opportunity, what did you mean by trusting tears?
Yeah, I find myself, I don't know why I'm a person that people cry with and then they feel bad about it. This happens a lot. They're like, I don't know, I didn't mean to start crying. And so I've always been curious about that. And I will say, especially for pastors and helpers who might be listening to this podcast, it's very easy to be the one who receives others, and
Hmm.
cares for them, and doesn't feel weird at all about being the one who's in the position of strength to care for another. But when the tables are turned and you're the one crying and you feel
Right.
a little out of control and vulnerable, like, that's the place where we really understand how we really feel about suffering and lament and grief. And so when people cry, I actually did a little research. So I was like, what's going on with tears? Like, why does this happen? What is the biological reason for crying? And people don't, like, biologists don't really know exactly. And some things that are postulated about tears is that it's like our mind's way of indicating that we need connection.
Mm.
It's like our body and our soul's way of saying, I need someone to notice that I'm vulnerable. And I just think that's really beautiful because it makes a lot of space for all kinds of tears that we can experience in
Hmm.
life. Tears of joy, tears of beauty and wonder, tears of vulnerability, tears of
Yeah.
sorrow. And we see in script, like, Joseph was crying all the time. Like, there is a lot of crying in this story. And, he's crying after acceptance, which, that's, you can find out in there and more about, I don't think one of the reasons why I love this story is because I feel like Joseph's been like, he's become this hero of Disney movies, and kind of the story is like the good guy wins in the end. Like, that's like, we're all like shaking our fists, like, yeah. And the rest of us are sitting around being like, well, I don't know if I'm the good guy and I don't think I'm winning in the end. And so where's God in
Right.
that? And that's just a complete misreading of the story, because with Joseph and with the amount of time that went by, I really believe that Joseph was at full acceptance with the life that God had given him and the place that he was well before his brothers come back on the scene. It's not like he was already at forgiveness and acceptance before he saw his brothers. And there's so much about that, the crying that he does and the lament and the loss, that I think we are, maybe a people who think we've got to like be the greatest salespeople for God, and like I can't show, sorrow. When in reality, I think that kind of sadness is an opportunity for us to identify more with the world, and the sadness of a broken world that we live in that isn't as it is intended, that this isn't our home. And there is a time and a place where there will be no more crying and no more tears and no more pain. And the new heavens and new earth will be real. And you and me, Steve, like we will be not living in, like, we're not going to be on a cloud with a harp. We're going to be in a resurrected world, in a revived world.
Where that even came from.
Yeah, I know,
the cloud and the harp thing.
Exactly. So, there's this place to say, what if we could trust that in the sadness, we can identify with our suffering Savior, and that when our hearts break open, I also believe they expand, and we can hold together both happy things and sad things, and we can have space in our life to be people who allow those things in our life and around us without trying to fix it, escape it, numb it, control it, in ourselves or in other people.
I can see where your point about expanding, your heart's expanding. There is nothing like having somebody who has walked a road similar to the one you're on, to be able to have the amount of empathy that a person might need. Even though other folks who don't have that might be very well intentioned and might be able to help to a point.
Sure.
But I think that when somebody has gone through something, they get extra tools to be able to help some that they didn't have before. And I do have a question about the biologists and the tears. What did they say about the ending of It's a Wonderful Life?
I don't know. If you think about the idea of connecting to the truth, that's what I often think. I say to people about tears, I think a lot of times tears come when we're really close to truth. Like we feel like we're in the real, and it sort of, it brings us to a deeper place. And for some that, brings tears to our eyes. And that's why I love tears. Although I will be the first to admit that, in my own season, in seasons that have been difficult, I don't want to be the one crying. I don't like being the one who's receiving care. And, I've had to work through being okay with being weak too. Not just being the strong one or the one that receives and cares for others, but also the one who's cared for.
The Apostle Paul himself was told by God when he asked to have his thorn removed that God's strength is made perfect in his weakness.
With Paul, one of the things I love about, again, little details in scripture, is that with Paul, like he was the first to always say the truth of who he was. Like which I think the more strength or influence or leadership, whatever season we might be in, the more of that we have, the more responsibility we have to speak the truth about our actual condition, that we're not the ones who have it figured out. It's amazing to me how many people think that pastors have it figured out. And they're like, oh, I'm like, no, we don't. I was with a pastor, coaching a pastor this week, and we were talking, and he had just lost his mom. And he said to me, well, at least she for sure knows if heaven is real. And this is a guy who's been a pastor for 50 years. It was so refreshing to me to have a pastor to pastor conversation that's like, we all know, like we're operating in faith, and we really hope that everything we believe is true, and we've staked our lives on it, but we have to live in the uncertainty.
Tell me about the long story. In the triumph section of your book, you're talking about, is that a question of eternal perspective, or is there something else that you're referring to there?
Yeah, I think that's great, Steve. I think, of course, eternal perspective is important. I think there has to be a sense. I was actually talking with some people and who were talking about like the veracity of Christianity and like how could a good God allow all this suffering? And I think one of the places that I always go back to is, what if this wasn't the whole story though? Like, what if time on earth is a portion of a story? How would we possibly be able to judge what a good God would do if all we're in is like a tiny part of the story, right? So that's just like a philosophical thought about eternity. But when it comes to the reality, people are struggling and suffering and disappointed and all that. I also think there's a part of trusting the long story in the way that redemption comes into our lives. I think it's very common when we've been betrayed or disappointed or let down to, especially in those cases, to sort of daydream about a linear reality like Joseph's. And I actually argue that Joseph's was not linear, but the idea of like you were betrayed and you were hurt, and then later in your story, those same people come back to you and they admit they were wrong. Like, doesn't that feel great? That's actually revenge. That's not really like redemption. That's just like wanting judgment, right? When in reality, I think the longer story is that God redeems in very creative ways, right, Steve? So you have a degenerative disease, like you've spoken of. There's a part of all of us that would want you to be cured and healed, and that to be the story, and that you get to bring God glory by that story. But redemption also means the way that you're caring for people differently, the way that people are experiencing you as a disciple of Jesus. Like, that's also redemption. That's a different story. It's a longer story, but it's a real story. And I think there's a part of our stories where we have to operate with some spiritual patience about what God's doing in our story and how he's working and reviving and redeeming all things that isn't quite so clean as that.
Life isn't clean. And one of the things that I've wanted to do with this particular podcast is occasionally we'll talk about a miracle story, but mostly this is about the ongoing struggle that people have, because not everybody is healed of everything.
Yes.
And when you have somebody come to you for help, and they're talking about that, they're talking about if God, why won't God take this away? How do you respond to that?
That's a hard one. I think first of all, there's a lot of pain there, right? And there's a lot of faith to admit that to another person. So I always try to make space to empathize with a life that feels unbearable or so long or whatever that might be disappointing.
Sure.
And then, there's always you can always have a philosophical discussion, which is not always usually the right thing to do when someone's suffering. I tend to be more silent than anything. But one thing I really take a lot of comfort in is that when we follow Jesus, we are following a God who took suffering upon himself and who has experienced every aspect of the human condition outside of the pain of sin, and did, I believe, take that shame upon himself on the cross. So in reality, experienced all aspects of the human condition. And speaking of, betrayal, that's one of those places where people are really like, I can't believe that God is not operating, there's some research out there that betrayal is one of the most difficult emotions to move through. One of the most painful things for a human being to go through. And I think about the levels of betrayal in Jesus' story of going to the cross, that like in the midst of physical pain, the actual like pain of watching your friends walk away or curse your name or betray you to others, like people that you trusted, and the pain of that. And that no matter what someone's going through, this is a religion where there's a God who said, I'll put on skin and move into the neighborhood and dwell like a human and experience all those things. And he was tempted in every way, but did not sin. One of the hardest things about our suffering is when we feel alone. And we have a God who went to the cross so that we never have to be alone. Like, there isn't a such thing. Now we can feel alone and we can be in a time where we're like, God, you're silent and I'm experiencing this dark night of my soul. But the existential reality of Christianity is that we never have to ever be alone. We will never be isolated again. He will never forsake us. He is never not with us. And that to me is a comfort. It's not an answer, it's a comfort in the midst of hard things.
I want to get to the way, the not the ending of the book in terms of a spoiler, but
Unlike spoiler alert, it's in the Bible, you guys. You can just go read it. But
like, it's a good thing you're not a novelist. So, Identity Reimagined. Tell me about that. That's kind of the culmination of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when I think about coming through and out of a season, so when I was a couple years ago, I was teaching the raw material for this book before it was written. And I was out at Mount Hermon in California, beautiful in the Redwoods, beautiful place. And I was teaching, I happened to be teaching a women's retreat. I've taught at their family camp too, but this particular time was women. And I taught a couple sessions and I was like, hey guys, I'm working on a book and it's hard to describe what I signed up for season is. It's not like one word. So if anyone has a story of a season like that and they want to just share it with me, I'm going to be under the trees on the back patio at 2 p.m. tomorrow. And if any of you guys want to come. Well, like so many people came that there wasn't enough room on the back patio. There's that many people who identified with the concept of a not what I signed up for season and wanted to share their story. And one of the themes, I promise I'm getting to this question, one of the themes that came out of that time as people shared their stories was, I would never sign up to go through that again, but my trust in God is altogether different coming through that.
Yes.
And a lot of them, it wasn't resolved. Like, it wasn't like, oh, like I had this and then I was healed and then I got divorced and then my husband asked for forgiveness. No, it's not that. But it's that when they feel the light dawning into a new season, they look back and see, I have a resiliency to my faith and a trust in God that I did not have before that I went through this. And that to me is the ultimate hope, because if the story's not over, if our earthly life is not the end, if this is one chapter of a longer story of an eternity, and this is one season within one chapter, the most important thing that could happen would be that you would trust in God more. Like that would be the best thing that could ever happen in that story, knowing that we're in a long story and that God is giving us a new identity in the long story of our earthly life. And the idea of identity is sort of woven all through Joseph's story. So key components of identity in, the ancient, Israel kind of context, the ancient Middle East, would be robes and rings. So the robe that I have on signifies my standing in whatever role I'm doing or wherever family I'm in. And the ring that I wear is a signal of my family and my status. And in the story of Joseph, robes are removed over and over again until he's finally sort of robed by Pharaoh as the governor of Egypt, and a ring is put on his finger. And in the story of Jesus, that same concept of robes is also used, where Jesus is stripped of his robe as he goes to the cross. The prodigal son, when you think about the story of the father meeting the son, he meets him and says, put a robe and ring on him. And I think that when things are stripped away from us is an opportunity to be re-robed and re-signified as like my ultimate identity is as a child of God. And everything else is secondary. And sometimes when we go through these seasons, we are painfully stripped of these other identities that can easily just kind of get wound into who we are. And we have an opportunity to trust God in our deepest and greatest and most important thing, which is our identity as a son or daughter of God.
So your new identity, in a sense, is, and this isn't a catchy way to put it, but a person who trusts in God more than they did before this happened.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I mean, we can come up with a better name later, but
exactly.
But I think actually that's a good thing. I think we can sell that short.
Yeah. Because it changes everything. Like it sounds like we didn't make it catchy, and it sounds kind of not profound maybe, but the reality is It's the most profound thing in the world, because literally the way you trust God is going to change every way that you move through the world. The way you manage your emotion, your mortality, your relationships, your vocation, your worries, all of those things are actually informed by that, by your trust in God.
Yeah. Nicole, thank you so much. This has been fascinating.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
How can people interact with you and get the
Absolutely.
book?
Well, yeah, I would love for you guys to get the book. Just so you know, it's a book and a Bible study. There's a
Okay.
video series on Right Now Media. So for those who like to study in a group, we do a deep dive into the story of Joseph through that Bible study. Lots of opportunities to reflect on your own story, as well as kind of connect and encourage others. And you can find me
Okay.
at NicoleUnice.com. It's with a U. It's very easy to find if you spell my last name right. And you can find the books everywhere books are sold. So would love for you to pick up a copy or join me over on my podcast. I do a podcast called How to Study the Bible every week. So that's an easy connection for those of you guys who like podcasts. Would love to invite you over to spend some time on mine.
Definitely. Definitely. We'll put all that in the show notes too.
Thank you.
And Nicole, I appreciate it. And thanks for the work that you do.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for joining us. And we'd like to see as many people encouraged as possible. And you can help by liking, sharing, and subscribing to this podcast, and by just telling your friends. Find new episodes at purposely.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Oh, and one more thing. If you enjoy Shaken, if you're encouraged by it, if you think someone else would be, give us a good review.